Hello, friends. This is your host, Prashant Daniel, and welcome to the Reasonable Truth Podcast, a program dedicated to helping Christians to understand, articulate, and defend their faith as winsome ambassadors of Christ. It's good to be back with you guys today, and it's been a while since we've done this. I was hoping to get an episode out last month or the month before, and we just haven't been able to do it. You know, people just busy schedules and things like that. You know how it is. But in any case, it's good to be back. And before we jump into our episode for today, I want to make a quick plug in for our conference. Reasonable Truth's annual conference is coming up. And for those of you who have missed the announcement, we have rebranded it. We're calling it Gravity Conference. So if you're interested in getting more details about that, go to reasonabletruth.org and you can register there. Early bird registrations go all the way till August. It's just $10, and after that, it's going to go up to $20. We have a great lineup of speakers there, one of whom is joining us today. And so if I guarantee you, you're going to enjoy today's episode. You're going to love everything our guest has to say. And if you are interested in hearing more from him, come attend our conference. See how we did that? See that little plug over there?
Very nice.
Yeah, nice little hook there, right? So, yeah, and at the conference, you're going to be able to ask him more questions, and he's going to give a more comprehensive, exposition of everything his expertise is in. So let me go ahead and encourage you to register for that conference. Go to reasonabletruth.org and register to get your tickets. All right. Let's get into today's episode. I have a special guest on here today. This is Alan Schliemann, who is a speaker with Stand to Reason, and it's really good to have him here with us today. We actually first met while we were both still at Biola, and I remember. I think you even graduated. We graduated on the same day, if I remember correctly. But anyways, Alan, welcome to the show, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. Looking forward to our conversation. And I think I remember the day for sure. I think that was in 2013.
Yep, right? It was December 2013. Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep. I even remember Craig Hazen, who's the director of the apologetics program. He got up there and he kind of made some sort of joke when he was announcing you. He said something about this is the About Time Award or something like that, Alan, for just how long you've been in the program.
Oh, yeah. I think I actually started taking classes in 1998.
You're kidding me.
No. It was like, but back then it was like Defending the Faith lecture series. It wasn't a formal apologetics program at the time. Mm-hmm. And then we were able to sort of like grandfather in those classes into the program if we applied to the MA program. So that's why. And then, I was working for Stand to Reason for so long, so it was hard to read these giant theological books while you're married, have kids, you're working full time, and they're like, okay, read this book and write a 20-page paper. And I'm like, there's no way I can do this,
Yeah.
So it took me a little while.
Right. No, that's great. That's fantastic. I did want to say, I'm not even sure if I've mentioned this to you. I don't even know if you remember this, but you were actually instrumental in encouraging me to put my work out there, Alan. I don't know if you remember us having this conversation, but it was sitting inside, I forget, not the main Biola cafeteria, but one of those little coffee shop like places inside in the Biola campus. And I was telling you about, hey, I just feel like God's called me to write, to speak, and do all that. And I don't know if, should I just put it out there, or should I have it run it through some people to double check and put it out there. And I remember what you said. I remember, hey, listen, if you did your homework, if you're confident about everything you've studied, and if you think that this is something that the world needs to hear, be confident and put your stuff out there and allow God to go from there. So I guess what now, about over a decade later, thank you for saying that.
Yeah,
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, were we sitting outside in that coffee shop? It has like an inside and outside place. We were sitting outside.
Yeah, I think so.
I do recall that. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a long time ago.
Wow. I'm so glad you remembered that. I mean, I'm encouraged by that. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
That's great.
For sure. So, yeah, Alan, you are again, as I introduced before, one of the speakers would stand to reason, but you are the, how do I say this? You're the hot topics guy. Maybe that's one way of saying it, because I know you deal with a lot of contentious issues, a lot of issues that are happening in the culture, a lot of topics that people are, find edgy. People are maybe even afraid to talk about. And you are willing to address that very well from a biblical perspective. And my hope is that we are able to cover some of that today. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with just, I think this is an issue that is just front and center in our faces every day in the culture. You see it on the news, you see it on Twitter, social media, everywhere. And that's the different ways that the sexual revolution is playing out in our lives. And so, it's really interesting because I was reading Carl Trueman's book, Strange New World, several months ago. And he does a beautiful sketch of how everything is panned out over the last several decades in America and kind of where all of that began, and kind of traces it. I don't think he was the first one to do that, but I'm just saying that he paints a very good picture, and he traces it all the way back to the invention of the birth control pill, and talking about how that kind of had an irreversible ripple effect over so many areas in culture and society. Speak to that a little bit. When even in all your studies and all the research that you have done, what do you think was kind of a landfall moment in, besides the birth control bill? What is an important moment in American cultural history that you think we're still feeling the effects of today?
Well, I think, I do believe, abortion and divorce and the birth control pill, all these things, of course, I think contributed to it. From a medical perspective, that kind of allowed people to be able to engage in sex acts without the, consequences of pregnancy and childbirth. And so obviously there's a ripple effect with that. I think the combination of that, along with the rise of postmodernism and relativism, I think also has contributed to all of this. It's hard to say to what degree each of these has played a factor, but I don't think you could deny that the idea that what's right and wrong is ultimately up to each individual would obviously play a huge role in the idea that we can engage in sexual acts with whoever we want without the repercussions of children. And if we have children, we can just abort them. And so all of these things, I think, play into it. I think, to the degree to which belief in God and fidelity to Christian values has diminished in our culture has also contributed to that, because if you don't believe in a God, if you don't believe in a maker, then you don't believe that we're made. And if you don't believe in we're made, then you don't really believe that we have a teleos, a design, a way that we're supposed to function. And marriage can be whatever, or it doesn't even have to be marriage. We don't have to even get married. We can just form couplings and have, sexual trysts, and it just whatever goes, right? So it just seems like there's been a combination of all these factors that has contributed to why we are where we are in our culture today. And of course, with relativism being so prominent, it's not just relativism when it comes to, say, morality, which is moral relativism, or relativism when it comes to religious belief, which is we call religious pluralism. But it seems like now relativism has even come to the point where, you can believe whatever you want to believe about your identity, right? You could think that if you're biologically male, that you're a female, or that you're male, or that you're both, or neither, or any combination of those things. So I think all of these things have played a role in contributing to where we are in our culture today.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the disconnection of sex from pregnancy just opened up a whole can of worms. And to what extent do you think the the feminist movement of the time also contributed to some of this. Do you think that influenced any of this? The 60s and 70s was such a tumultuous time in American culture, but yeah, speak to that a little bit. There was obviously some very great tectonic shifts happening in the culture that definitely compounded this problem, I think.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll just first of all, I'll just admit this isn't my particular area of study where I've kind of studied the origins of the sexual revolution. I don't doubt, though, that feminism would play a role in all of this. I mean, again, to the degree to which feminism helped contribute to the idea that, women can, be freed from the shackles of, the patriarchy and no longer need to be married, and they can engage in sexual acts as often as they want. And, they should have the same sort of equal freedoms to do that without the risk of pregnancy. And so, I mean, all of that, to the degree that the feminist movement contributed to that, I'm sure also contributed to where we're at. I mean, I'm not the right person to ask, like, to what degree did it? Because I don't know. I mean, that's a hard question, and maybe a sociologist or someone could be able to answer that better. But I think you're right to point to all these things as contributing factors to putting us kind of where we are today.
Right. It made me think of, you kind of think of some of these post-Enlightenment thinkers, like Rousseau and Descartes and all these guys. And there's such an emphasis on the subjective, such an emphasis on the elevation of what is happening inside of you, to the point where the external doesn't even matter, like objective reality doesn't even matter. And you just see how that is playing out. And we're going to get to it later. We'll talk about the trans movement and all that, where you probably see the greatest effect happening. But what do you think is going on with, there's so many ways in which our identity can be fleshed out. Why is it that sexuality seems to be one of the primary ways in which our culture is finding its identity today? What do you think?
Yeah, well, it goes back to, I think, what you were referring to in Carl Trueman's book, Strange New World, and his much larger book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, where he talks about this idea of expressive individualism. And I think what's happened with regards to what you're talking about, and how, like, well, why sexuality becomes so key to this, this idea of expressive individualism, I think, has created a thinking where we now give total authority to our inner feelings. We grant our inner beliefs and thoughts and feelings complete authority. And so if you feel a certain way on the inside, as you said, then you try to make that a reality on the outside. And since our sexual desires are so closely tied to kind of a core sense of who we feel we are, whether or not that's accurate or not is irrelevant, but that's certainly the way most people feel when they think about their sexuality. It's like, oh man, that is really core to who I am. I mean, you look at the gay rights movement. I mean, people who think, well, I'm attracted to members of the same sex. I mean, this is more than just simply an attraction. This is a part of my identity. And so there's a whole community of people who believe they are, they have a connection towards one another as a result of their sexual attractions. So yeah, I think because sexuality is so closely tied to a core sense of self, that it's become a major topic by which we organize our thoughts and our lives around, and we identify with kind of our sexual feelings and desires.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about abortion, because obviously abortion is a huge part of all of this, huge wing of the sexual revolution. I believe it was in the 90s that Bill Clinton once said that, abortion should be safe, legal, and rare.
Yeah.
And we can unpack that to all kinds of levels. We just don't have the time for that right now. But it seems to be that abortion is no longer seen as some sort of, at least to use the Clintonian language, some sort of unfortunate thing, like setback that we can deal with. Rather, today it has been elevated to almost something virtuous. I think there was sometime last year, there was some comedian who even she got up there, she gave some speech, and she mentioned that she regretted not having an abortion. It was almost like some sort of badge that she wished she could wear. I can't remember her name right now, but it was trending on Twitter and all that. So explain, just give us like a quick like machine gun treatment of what are some of the common pro-choice arguments, at least the most strong ones, the most compelling ones, if you think, and what are some better ways that we could respond to some of that? I know that's a big ask, but let's see if we can do that quick.
Yeah, well, there's okay, so there's so many different kinds of categories, I should say, of defenses for abortion. You have your sort of defenses that you'll find sort of on the street, which are like things like, well, women should have a right to choose. I have a right to privacy. A lot of women can't afford to have multiple children, or maybe they have multiple already and they don't want another one. Rape, of course, is a huge and really common defense for abortion. In other words, if a woman gets raped, should she be forced to carry that child to term? Incest. So you have a whole slew of these. And in fact, when I remember when I debated a women's studies professor, she's a feminist at a university in San Diego, and we debated the question: should abortion remain legal, or should it be illegal? Whatever. It was the legality of abortion. And I remember after our debate, we took questions from the audience, and I think of the maybe 7 or 8 questions that were asked of me, 3 of them were about rape. So it was just kind of surprising. I mean, it wasn't surprising. It was just kind of interesting to note that so many people are really bothered by this question. I mean, of course, the moderator should have been like, all right, well, Alan's already answered this question. But for a lot of people, that has a lot of rhetorical power to say, man, you pro-lifers think that a woman should have to carry a child that she's conceived in rape. So in one sense, that's emotionally, rhetorically, a very powerful defense for abortion, and one that happens all the time in terms of if you're in a conversation about abortion. I think actually Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, recently, there was a video that went viral where some pro-lifer put a smartphone in Justin Trudeau's face, started talking to him about abortion, and Justin Trudeau basically challenged him and brought up the issue of rape. And the pro-lifer, kind of wasn't able to really navigate the conversation. And so the video went viral. It's like, Justin Trudeau owns this pro-lifer. Now, the pro-lifer clearly didn't have a very sophisticated understanding of the issues, but it just goes to show that subject, that defense for abortion, is perhaps one of the most common, most rhetorically powerful defenses that you'll hear.
So since we're on that topic, what is an ideal pro-life response? Because I'm sure that even our listeners who are listening to this right now have struggled with that question. They've been like, man, okay, all the other, arguments, okay, I could see the logic behind it, but when you have something that's so emotionally compelling, what's a good response to the rape argument?
Well, first of all, a lot of pro-lifers make a mistake when they respond to the defense of the pro-life view when it comes to rape. And the mistake they make is this: they immediately jump to a bunch of logical arguments in favor of the pro-life view, and it comes across as completely callous and insensitive to the tragedy and evil of rape. And see, the problem is that a lot of times when the subject of rape comes up, it's not a test to see if the pro-lifer has a logical response. It's a test to see if the pro-lifer has a heart. And oftentimes we pro-lifers fail that test because we come across as like this robotic, machines that are just kind of answering the argument against, abortion, And so we
become defensive.
Well, we become defensive, or we just sort of like, focus in on the logical arguments and forget that it's possible we're talking to someone who was raped, or who knows someone who was raped and got pregnant, and they're just trying to see, are you a person with compassion and care for human beings, or do you just want to win an argument? So the first thing I tell pro-lifers when I teach on this is like, man, you need to first pause whenever this subject comes up and take some time to acknowledge the evil of rape, to perhaps if you're talking to a woman, just be mindful of the fact that it could be she's bringing it up because that happened to her. Obviously, if it's a guy, it didn't happen to him, but it could be that maybe he had a girlfriend or his mom or who knows, right? So we have to first be sensitive to that topic and just do your due diligence to make sure that you show that you care about this issue and you don't want to see women being raped, and that's horrible. And the people who did these things to women should be brought to justice in the best possible way we can have them brought to justice. So once I explain that, my first response in terms of addressing the argument, though, is to show that when someone offers a defense for abortion in the case of rape, what's happening, and this happens in many defenses for abortion, is that they are presuming that the unborn is not a human being.
Right.
And if you are a pro-lifer and you want to make any headway in this conversation, you cannot let that assumption continue, because you will be at a strategic disadvantage in making any kind of a case for the pro-life view if you don't first unpack that assumption and challenge it. Because if the unborn is not a human being, then absolutely a woman should be able to get an abortion, whether she was raped or not raped, for any reason or for no reason.
That's right.
Because the unborn is not a human being. But when people make a defense for abortion in the case of rape, they're presuming typically that the unborn is not a human being. And so the way I try to expose that assumption is I ask a question. And this question is based on a tactic that we teach at Stand to Reason called trot out the toddler. And here's the question. I say this: suppose for a moment, Prashanth, you and I are in a room together, and there's a 2-year-old girl standing next to us. Okay, she's got she's playing with a doll. She's kind of standing there, just hanging around. And suppose for a moment that girl was conceived through rape, and her mother, carried her to term, and now that girl's 2 years old. Okay, here's my question: can the mother kill that 2-year-old girl because she was conceived in rape? Now, I've asked that question to hundreds of people, including Planned Parenthood employees, and everyone answers the question exactly the same. And they say this: no, Alan, there's no way. No, of course you can't kill a 2-year-old girl just because she was conceived through rape. And then they say, but that's different. The 2-year-old girl is obviously a human being. The unborn is not. And then my response is, well, that's where we differ. You see, I think the unborn is a human being, just like the 2-year-old girl. So, and you disagree with that, fine. But to me, that's the real question that we have to unpack first, is what is the unborn? Is the unborn like a 2-year-old girl, or is it like something else and not a human being? We have to answer that question first. And so notice it, if it turns out that the unborn is a human being, just like the 2-year-old girl, then you can't kill the unborn for the reason that he or she was conceived in rape, for the same reason you can't kill a 2-year-old because they were conceived in rape. So this question where I trot out a toddler and say, hey, here's a 2-year-old toddler, can we kill them for the reason that you just gave for abortion? This exposes the question, what is the unborn? Which, Prashanth, I will tell you that this is the most fundamental question that has to be resolved first before you can move forward in any conversation about abortion. Because if you don't answer it, it'll be presumed the unborn is not a human being, and then every defense for abortion will be super successful, and it'll be very hard for you to undo any kind of a case that they're making. So that's the first step I would take. And then, of course, if they say, well, you're right, I don't think the unborn's a human being like the 2-year-old. You think they are, Mr. Pro-Lifer? Okay, go ahead and make your case. In which case, at that point, I would then offer my scientific defense for the full humanity of the unborn from the moment of conception.
Right. No, that's exactly right. I think the fundamental question when it comes to the issue of abortion is not whether it has nothing to do with the freedom of the woman, although that's how the culture wants to portray it. Rather, it comes down to the ontology, right? What is the unborn? That is the ultimate question. And for those of you listening online, if you want to see a more comprehensive treatment of this issue by Alan, I'm going to put some links in the description section of the show where you guys can go to Stand to Reason's website, and you can see the resources where Alan actually unpacks all of these arguments in detail. All right, we have about 5 minutes left before we move into our break. Alan, let's talk about the transgender issue. This is obviously a very contentious, it's probably the most pressing and most intrusive of everything that's happening right now. It's got ripple effects in every direction, every part of society. There's it's affecting sports and bathroom usage, right, and prisons. And the fact of the matter is, when you look around society and look at all these institutional structures, if you will, they are based on a gender binary. Everything around us is designed, it's based on that, and yet that is precisely what the trans movement is upending. And what was it, back in 2020? I think there was a case where the Supreme Court decided that I think they ruled like 6-3 for Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, where they're now treating the transgender issue as a civil rights issue. How did this movement become so huge so fast? Ironically enough, it's grown faster and accomplished a lot more quicker than the actual original civil rights issue itself. How did this happen?
Oh boy. Well,
best of luck doing that in about 4 minutes. So.
Yeah, right. I mean, in a nutshell, I guess I would point people to the book that you recommended at the beginning, which is Strange New World by Carl Trueman. To me, I think that book is the best captures how we got where we're at. And, again, I hate to sound repetitive, but it goes back to the point that he makes in the book and that what we're talking about, which is the idea that we now give total authority to our inner feelings and beliefs. And so if you feel some way on the inside, you feel like, let's say I'm biologically male. Suppose I feel female, or I think I feel female, or I think I feel something else. Then we grant that feeling total authority. In other words, we almost believe it's inerrant, which really is an interesting kind of claim, because it's like, well, are our thoughts really inerrant? I mean, you think about, if you're biologically male, but you have a thought that you're female, which reality do you think probably is more likely to be inerrant, your body or your thoughts? Well, of course, your thoughts kind of routinely change, right? I mean, you can change your mind about a whole bunch of things on a regular basis, but your body doesn't really change. If I'm XY chromosome kind of person with a body who's organized around, the production of sperm, and so that's not going to change. But interestingly, we've come to a point in society where we give our minds and our thoughts total authority. And so if your body is male, but your gender identity, which is a kind of a core sense of who you believe yourself to be, if it's not male, if it's female, what we're saying today is change your body to make it match up with your gender identity. Now, historically, we've done the opposite. We've said no, like say 20 years ago, hey, if your gender identity is different than your body, let's go through counseling and therapy and help you take your gender identity to make it match up and align with your body. But today we're doing the opposite. We're saying, no, let's change your body to make it line up with your gender identity. And that is a remarkable thing that we're now doing. So right. Yeah, that's kind of where we're at. But I think it goes back to giving our inner thoughts total authority. That's the main problem.
Yeah, I want to piggyback real quick on what you said about kind of the medical establishment. Even I think they're to a large extent also very culpable in this movement. It used to be, I mean, what was the creed is do no harm, right? That's the the original medical creed is do no harm. The Hippocratic Oath, that's right. And so it was the doctor's job, regardless of what the patient thought or felt, to do what is right in the bigger picture for the patient. Right. And yet today, when you look at the medical landscape, at least as insofar as it pertains to the trans issue, it's become about affirmative healthcare. I believe that's the term that's kind of trending, is affirmative healthcare, where
gender affirmation surgery.
Gender affirmation, and the patient is no longer seen as a patient, but rather seen as a customer, where it is the doctor's job to please the customer, because the customer is always right. Do you think that's a little simplistic way of saying it? But I think that's the reality, right?
No, that is kind of reality. I mean, obviously there's more to it, but what's interesting is it's not just Christians who are against this, even atheists are against it. A lot of evolutionary biologists I've seen talk about this, and they're against it because they believe, well, a number of reasons. Number one, they say it's pseudoscience, right? Because scientifically we know that there's only two sexes, male or female. And second of all, they point out the fact that if you're an atheist, there is no you trapped in someone else's body. There's no soul. There's no sense of self that could be different than your body. You are your body. There's no soul who's like female and your body is male. So they reject it for that as another reason. And then thirdly, and here's the interesting thing, they think it's all about money. They say if a person transitions to gender affirmation surgery, they call it, which is a euphemism, but once that happens, that person will now be on drugs for the rest of their life to maintain their status as what they believe to be the opposite sex, because they're going to need drugs and hormones to keep them in that sort of position. And that'll be, they'll be a lifelong customer of the pharmaceutical industry. So interestingly, even atheists and non-Christians are oftentimes vigorously against this, just because they believe it's anti-scientific, and they believe these people are being exploited by, as you said, the healthcare industry that's sort of going along. And yeah, I mean, I guess they've been sold a bill of goods, and they are going to go along with it for fear that they're going to lose their jobs, right? So there's a whole bunch of pressures on the medical industry to kind of go along with this, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, that's right. Two other sources I want to point toward for those of you listening online. If you guys want a good philosophical kind of 30,000-foot treatment of this, check out When Harry Became Sally. I think that's was it Neil?
Yeah. Ryan Anderson.
Ryan Anderson. I keep saying Neil Anderson. No, it's Ryan Anderson's book.
He was an author too.
Right, When Harry Became Sally, and also Abigail Shrier's book, Irreversible Damage, is also an excellent treatment of the subject. And if you guys want to see kind of how the culture, how this plays out on the street level, on a cultural level, academia and things like that, check out Matt Walsh's documentary, What is a Woman? That is not, I think that you have to be subscribed to the Daily Wire to be able to see that, but that's not that's not necessarily a treatment of the subject as much as you just see how much this ideology has just infiltrated the culture. And it is somewhat humorous, I would say, to see how these supposedly professionals are just twisting themselves into pretzels just for being asked a simple question of what is a woman. So anyways, this is the transgender issue is a huge issue. We could spend hours on this, which we do not have, but we are going to go into a break right now. And so Alan, when we get back from the break, what we're going to do is, we kind of addressed all of these things abstractly, and I want to bring it down a little bit after the break and make it more practical from a more Christian biblical worldview perspective. So anyways, let's go take that break right now, and we'll be right back, so stay tuned. All right, welcome back to the Reasonable Truth podcast, and our guest today is Alan Shlemon with Stand to Reason. We've been talking about a bunch of really hot issues, talking about abortion, the sexual revolution, the transgender movement, and all that. And in this segment, I want to pick Alan's brain on how can Christians think about this from a more practical perspective. And so, Alan, let's start off with the pro-life issue, because we kind of led with that in the first segment.
Sure.
Abortion rates have been in a steady decline for about a decade or so, I think a little over a decade now. But obviously there's way more work to be done. I think for a lot of Christians, Christians actually shy away from this issue. I think it's kind of emblematic of a bigger problem. We keep shying away from a lot of bigger cultural issues, which I think is sort of the reason why we're where we're at today. But how would you encourage Christians to deal with the pro-life cause, both in terms of how to think about it, but even also methodologically, what's the best way to engage the pro-life issue?
Well, I think we need to take really a three-pronged approach to addressing abortion. And the three prongs would be personally, publicly, and politically. So what I mean by personally is I think every believer has to resolve in their own minds that they themselves will not participate in abortion. And the reason I say that is because even though a lot of people who are identified as believers would say they're attitudinally pro-life, oftentimes when push comes to shove or someone gets pregnant and they get in a bind, we see a lot of Christians engaging in abortion. In fact, according to the data that we have, I think it's like 70% of Protestants, 70% of people who have abortion identify themselves as Protestant. 24% identify themselves as Catholic. I think 13% identify themselves as evangelical Protestant.
I'm sorry, that first number, did you say 17% or 70%?
17.
17%. Okay.
17, yeah. So 17 mainline Protestant. I think it's around 13 or 14 that are evangelical Protestant, and 24% that are Catholic. So in other words, Christians are killing their own children. We know that's happening. And so that's why I say one of the prongs that is required for us to address abortion is, personally, we need to resolve not to have abortion ourselves. Like that's right. That's key. Okay. The publicly part means that we as Christians need to engage publicly in making a case for the pro-life view from science and from philosophy, engaging debates, writing, speaking, whatever we got to do. And then, but publicly doesn't involve just that. It also involves being the hands and feet of Jesus to women who are facing crisis pregnancies. And what that means is that when we know of someone who is perhaps abortion minded, a lot of times what we find is if that woman can be cared for, loved, and provided the resources and compassion and support that she needs, many times she will decide not to abort her child. So in pregnancy resource centers right now, which outnumber abortion clinics in our country, are one of the great sort of front lines of the movement by many pro-lifers to reach women who are facing crisis pregnancies and to be able to support and care for them and love them. So that's what I mean by publicly, is we need to make a thoughtful defense for the pro-life view, and we need to care for abortion-minded women or women who are facing crisis pregnancies. And then the third prong is political.
Hold on really quickly before you move on to the political. Let me play devil's advocate for a little bit.
Sure.
What if someone were to say, but Alan, why do I need to learn all these tactics and understand all of these things? As I'm a Christian, the Bible teaches me that all people are made in the image of God, and that God's authoritative word is good enough for me. So that's enough. What would you say to that?
Well, everything they said is, everything that person says like that is true. Yeah, of course. As you know, the Bible is authoritative and sufficient, whatever. Yes, you might be a believer, you might be saved, and whatever. But this is also a matter of following, I believe, Jesus' commands, which is to love your neighbor, right? So we see Jesus teaching this in various ways. People ask him, well, who's your neighbor? And then what does Jesus do? He tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Where you have a priest and a Levite walk past a person who's been beaten and left for dead. And then a Samaritan, who was kind of the enemy of a lot of these people at the time, comes by and not only sees this person, but has compassion on them. And then not just has an attitude of compassion, but demonstrates their compassion through, doing some physical act of caring for the person, right? Notice Jesus doesn't castigate the priest and Levite because they didn't have compassion, but rather because they did nothing to show the compassion. And so Jesus says, go and do the same. And so if the unborn is part of the community of people who is our neighbor, then we're commanded to love those unborn people who are the most vulnerable in our society, right? Perhaps they're the most vulnerable of all people is the unborn, because they have no ability. They're completely at the whim and of a mother who wants to terminate her, who wants to have an abortion, and who is willing to hire a professional to kill that child. So I think that as Christians, we're called to love our neighbors, and the unborn is our neighbor because the unborn is a human being just like you and me, and I can show that scientifically and philosophically. And so therefore, that's why I think we should care about the unborn.
Yeah, that's right. I think also sometimes we have this assumption that the Bible is important to us, and so if we cite the Bible, that should be enough. But a lot of cases, more often than not, especially if you're speaking to a skeptic or an unbeliever, the Bible is not an authoritative source for them. So this is why it's not helpful to lead with the Bible, right? And we have to be able to come at it from different angles.
Oh yeah, I mean, when I teach on this topic, I can make a purely secular defense for the pro-life view without appealing or even mentioning God or the Bible. And by the way, you were mentioning resources about coming to our website to learn about my teaching on abortion. We actually have an entire course for free called "Making Abortion Unthinkable" in
That's right.
in the section of our website called STRU, Stand to Reason University, and you can go click on that, and there's a whole course that I've done with videos and test questions that will help you to learn the material and learn the tactics.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I'll make sure to put a link to that so people can access that directly. Let's talk about engagement. We've touched on it a little bit. Alan, the Christian church, I've noticed we have this thing when it comes to sexual issues, when it comes to any problem or deviancy that is related to sexuality. We treat that as if it's the worst of the worst issues. Ironically enough, I've seen a lot of people react more harshly to sexual issues than to other things like pride or greed, or things like that, which I think could be argued could rot you faster in some ways.
Oh yeah, sure,
for sure. And so, how does the Christian how should the Christian church change the way we think about this issue? Because I think some of that is what contributes to maybe a lack of compassion. And you talk about this all the time. There's tons of your resources as well where you talk about having a compassionate engagement, whether it's with people who are in same-sex marriages, or whether it's the LGBTQ camp, or the trans camp, or abortion, or whatever the case may be. Make a case for what is the best way for us to have compassion and engage compassionately for people who are struggling with these issues.
Wow. Well, there's so much to say about that. I mean, number one, I think we have to remember that every human being, including every person who identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, pansexual, whatever, okay, is made in the image of God and therefore intrinsically valuable, and therefore is equally valuable to every other human being. And so that means that we as Christians are the ones who are have the worldview that justifies showing love and compassion and care for individuals who are part of the LGBT community. I mean, we have all people in culture, more so than secular people, more so than Hollywood, have a justification for showing love and compassion, and of course communicating the truth to LGBT individuals. Now, what that also means is there is no place for derogatory language or coarse joking about people in the LGBT community, because to do so is to mock an image bearer of God. So we have to, really end with all of the coarse joking that I see, and unfortunately I still see it all the time in the church. People making fun of people who are gay or trans or whatever. So that's one thing to consider. But the other thing I would say is, man, we need to, and I don't know, I'll say this and I'm going to add a qualifier, but we really need to develop, make our churches, and I hate to use this phrase, a safe space, but I'll qualify what I mean by that.
Sure,
safe space for people who are wrestling with their sexuality and their faith and their gender identity. And when I say safe space, I don't want you to think like, oh, we're welcoming of people engaged in sexual sin and we don't think it's a sin. No. Homosexual sex is sin. The Bible teaches that. Satisfying transgender ideation is sin, and I can argue that biblically. I'm not, if you want me to, that's fine. But so I'm not saying it's not sin. What I'm saying is this: kind of going to your point earlier about how we treat sexual sins differently, what I'm saying is this: if someone comes out to you in your church and says, "Hey, Prashanth," or "Hey, Alan, I think I'm struggling with same-sex attraction," or "I'm confused about my gender identity," let's not just sort of blast them with a Bible verse and kick them out of the church. Let's extend them a little bit of grace. Let's show them the love that we would want shown to us if we were wrestling with a long-term, ongoing struggle with whatever sin we're wrestling with, right?
That's right.
If I was struggling with some sin on a regular basis for decades or year, whatever, I would want someone to come alongside me and show me love and prayer and support and compassion. And it could be that during that time in which I'm struggling with this particular sin, I might succumb to temptation and participate in that sin. And what I'd want would be someone to say, "Oh my gosh, brother Alan, hey, how can I love for you? How can I pray for you? How can I support you?" But for some reason, when it comes to some of these other sexual sins that you're bringing up, we do take a different approach. We tend to be more like, "Oh my gosh, they did X, Y, or Z. They got to be out of here." And we're ending our relationship, or we're kicking them out of the church. And we're not extending any kind of grace for some people who are really wrestling with their understanding of their own sexuality. So that's what I would love to see, a culture shift in our churches, where again, we're not softening our ethics. We're not lowering the bar. No. We're still calling sin. Okay. We're not compromising, but let's just treat sexual sins like we would treat other sins, where, yeah, somebody might succumb to a sexual sin or some other sin, but we also want to be able to extend grace to those people if they are genuinely seeking to follow Christ. Now, I'll add another qualification here, though, Prashanth, because I know you talked about sexual sins and how we see them differently. The Bible does make a distinction between sexual sin and non-sexual sin. So in 1 Corinthians 6:18, Paul talks about how sexual sin is a sin committed against the body, whereas non-sexual sins are committed outside the body. So, and this is 1 Corinthians 6:18, I think. I don't know if I already said that. But so there is something different about sexual sin that justifies us drawing some lines or drawing some distinctions between the two. But in terms of the way we respond to people who are wrestling with sin, I think, yeah, we gotta show a lot more grace. And I think about the verse, and I think it's in Romans, where it says it's God's kindness that leads people to repentance. Well, let's be the hands and feet of God and show that kindness to people who are struggling in this area, rather than just being sort of like, "You're out of here," the first moment we notice they sin.
Right. No, that was a very good response. It makes me think. I really like what you said about safe space, and I think it is important to qualify that, because unfortunately, a lot of terms have gotten hijacked in our culture, and I think when Christians hear safe space, they're like, "Whoa, this is like it sounds kind of woke to me." But the reality is that Jesus's presence was a safe space for a lot of people during his time, and not so much for others. But the fact of the matter is that, I think of the woman who was caught in adultery and who came to him, and she was dragged to him. But there was, you could say there was a kind of, she felt safe there, and he made her feel safe even after that, even in saying, "I don't condemn you, go and sin no more." But I want to, that actually wasn't the original point I was going to make, but I was talking to John. I've had John Noyes on our podcast a long time ago. This was sometime last year, and I remember he and I were talking about church culture. And unfortunately, I think I love the church. The church is God's gift to us. It's an institution that is for us, and so I don't want to sound like I'm beating up on the church, but unfortunately, church culture sometimes creates this kind of giant wall that becomes unscalable for people who are on the outside, and it's not relegated to just sexual issues. It can be all kinds of issues. I've been in situations where in churches that I've attended, where people have come to me, and especially just knowing the field that I'm in and some of the things they've heard me teach, they'll come to me in private and confess, "Prashanth, I actually believe something different about this, but I've been afraid to say. I've been afraid to even ask that question to our pastor or to our elders, because I just know that they're going to come down really harshly on this. So, anyways, that speaks to, I think, a kind of a bigger picture, and not just sexual issues, but the church's the church is being open to anything that is different, or churches being open to things that we would consider problematic. Wouldn't you say that's emblematic of kind of a bigger church culture issue?
Yeah, I think so. And it, because when someone says to you, "Hey, I think I might be gay, or I might be trans, or whatever," because obviously this is sort of a new frontier that the church is facing, we freak out about it. When in reality, I think the response should be, if somebody says that to you, you should be like, "Wow, first of all, thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you for being vulnerable and trusting me with that. Like, man, can you tell me like what's going on? Like, tell me your story." Like, invite them to share. And again, it's not because we're trying to draw them out and affirm them in their sin. No. It's that we're just trying to show that we're a human being that cares for this person who is probably wrestling with something that they've been struggling with for years, right? And so that's what I mean by, we want to make a church a place where people feel safe enough to say to a leader or to a friend, "Hey, this is what I'm struggling with. Can you walk with me through this process as I try to unpack this?" And I feel like that's not the case right now. Right now, I mean, it's getting better, but I think right now it's a lot of people are afraid to do that. That was the case with homosexuality, decades ago. Right. But if you come out and said, "I think I struggle with same-sex attraction," it's like, you're losing your job. You're kicked out of the church. And I think we've gotten better at that, because now we have, some pastors who struggle with same-sex attraction, or who are elders. And I mean, they're not satisfying those attractions. They're still, mortifying them and trying to obey Christ. But when it comes to some of these other, trans or non-binary stuff, like, I think people still are freaking out about that, because like you said, it is a different thing. And we're like, whoa, how do we handle this?
Right. Wonderful. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, Alan. So I want to do this. Give us some parting words of wisdom for the church. We've talked about a broad array of issues. We've talked about abortion, touched on same-sex marriage, the trans issue, engaging with the LGBTQ community. If you were to do like a sort of, big picture summary of practical advice that you would give for Christians as it pertains to the sexual revolution and the way it's playing out in the culture, what would that be? What kind of advice would you give? Also, really quickly, I think I interrupted you earlier when you were making a 3-point case for the personal, public, and political. I think I asked you a question right after you made the public thing, and you didn't get to the political part. So go ahead and weave that into this question so we can wrap it up there.
Sure. Well, just to finish that thought off, you're right. I was talking about the 3-pronged approach to dealing with abortion. It's personally, publicly, and politically. So the political is just simply that, as pro-lifers who eventually become participating in civics and government, and we need to address abortion from the political element as well. So we're addressing abortion personally, publicly, and politically. So we're hitting it from all different angles, and I think that's the best way to eventually overturn a culture in which it's affirming of abortion as a solution to whatever's abortion is being used to solve. So that's all I was going to say about that. Is just, that's the 3rd-pronged approach. In terms of just general principles, though, that apply, or general philosophy of how to address all the sexual issues that we've been talking about, I mean, I've noticed that as I've created these presentations where I go and speak at churches and talk about transgenderism or homosexuality or whatever, I always subtitle my talks with, like, for example, I'll call my talk on homosexuality. It'll be homosexuality, subtitled Truth and Compassion, or transgenderism, Truth and Compassion. And it's not just some clever, cute title. I actually divide up my presentation in talking about, well, what is the truth about this subject? In other words, what does God, what does Scripture say about homosexuality, or what does it say about transgenderism? But knowing the truth is not enough, because oftentimes we Christians get or we're tempted to use the truth like a club to beat people over the head with.
That's right.
And I think it's really important that we learn how to not just know the truth, but speak that truth in a compassionate way. And I think this is representative of the way Jesus, right, was known. Jesus was known as being full of grace and full of truth, right? Grace and truth.
That's right.
So yeah, truth and compassion is kind of similar. And I think we should be like that. And so I spend usually half of my presentation talking about, well, what does it look like to be compassionate in your engagement on something as controversial as homosexuality or transgenderism? And so I try to give practical principles to Christians to help them navigate their conversations and their relationships with friends and family that they have that identifies LGBT. Because probably everyone who's listening to our podcast right now knows someone, a friend or a family member, who identifies in that way. And what they're probably asking themselves is, what should my relationship look like with that person? How do I continue in a relationship with a person who is trans or homosexual, but without compromising my convictions, you know? And I will admit to you, having personally friends and family who identify as LGBT, it can get very, very messy, and it can get very difficult. And my wife and I have made many decisions that were incorrect, wrong decisions that were unhelpful, unbiblical, or just uncompassionate. And over the years, we've had to sort of work through that and hone our approach so that we are uncompromising in truth, but also compassionate. And that requires the church to really get trained. And unfortunately, when I say that, that sounds really boring and dull. It's like, oh, what's Alan prescribing? Well, Alan's prescribing more training. Well, that's such a boring word, training. Right. But in reality, that's what we need to do. We need to learn
that's exactly right.
practical ways of engaging these topics and not shy away from them, even though they're, uncomfortable sometimes. So that's my general belief, is combining truth and compassion is a way to sort of have a big picture look at how we should approach our relationships. Because I think a lot of people believe that you can't combine the two. I know a lot of young believers who will say to me, Alan, my friend just came out and said they're gay. And now I feel like I have to make a decision between one or the other, either fidelity to my relationship with that person or fidelity to what the Bible teaches. And they create this false dichotomy where they have to pick one or the other. And I'm like, you don't have to pick one or the other. You can keep both. You can keep your relationship and don't compromise your convictions. Now, I agree. I fully admit that's the harder approach.
Right.
But I think it's the better approach. It's doable, but it is messy.
That's right. And I think it requires that we actually do the homework. It requires that we learn, we study about these issues, we look up resources, we learn about. I think a lot of the problem for the Christian church is we don't have our finger on the pulse of culture. That's a term I use all the time. It's important to have a finger on the pulse of culture. And I think if we go into our own bubble because we just think the world is yucky, then we don't know anything about what's happening there. And by proxy, we don't learn how to engage with those issues. So I think that's exactly right. Alan, wonderful, my brother. I wish we had another whole hour. We barely scratched the surface here. There's so much more below the waters that we could deal with, but that is all the time we have for today. For those of you listening online, Alan deals with a lot more than just these issues. He has so many other areas of expertise as well. So I will make sure to leave a link in the description section, a few different links, so you can go on to Stand to Reason's site and check out their training resources. You can check out Alan's work. They have fantastic resources. Stand to Reason is probably my number one most favorite apologetics ministry out there. And so, yeah, they do some incredible work, and really, really glad for everything that you guys are doing, Alan. Thank you so much.
$20 as a payment for that endorsement. No, I'm just kidding.
Fantastic. But then again, for those of you listening online, Alan is going to be one of the speakers at our conference, the Gravity Conference in California. It's going to happen at Sovereign Way Church in Hesperia on September 30th. So make sure to go onto our website and get your tickets to come listen to Alan in person. He'll unpack a lot of the stuff that we talked about today in greater detail. And there will also be breakout sessions where you guys will be able to personally ask him some direct and more practical questions as well. Wonderful. Alan, thank you so much for being available and making it, brother. I know you're a really busy guy, and so I really appreciate you making the time to come and join us on the show.
Oh, I'm glad I could. I loved it. Thanks, Prashant.
Fantastic. All right, folks. Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode of the Reasonable Truth Podcast. If you did, make sure to follow us on Apple iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and share it with your friends and family. For more information on the ministry, visit reasonabletruth.org. That's reasonabletruth.org. And until next time, keep the faith, and we'll see you on our next episode.